Britain's longest-serving female prisoner is finally being released after 40 years behind bars. Maria Pearson, now 70, from Hartlepool, stabbed her ex-boyfriend's new partner Jeanette Newton to death in 1986 and was jailed for life the following year. Pearson, who was 31 at the time, was found guilty of what the judge described as a cruel and vicious murder of her 23-year-old love rival. In a parole board decision, officials said Pearson was in a bigamous relationship with her second husband at the time of the murder, remaining married to her first husband. It was when her second partner met Newton and decided to annul their marriage. Pearson was left fearing she would lose their home and custody of a child. She tracked Newton's movements and routines and fatally attacked her as she left her home. Pearson tried to blame her husband at the trial, but this was dismissed, and the judge stated that she was obsessive and jealous. The mother of three was told she would have to serve a minimum of 12 years behind bars, which was completed in October 1998. However, she has remained behind bars ever since, spending 2 periods in an open prison before being returned to high-security jails because of concerns about her aggressive behaviour. This is the 10th time that the parole board has considered her case, with hearings for the latest review taking place in January and May this year. Her conditions of release include living in a designated address, which would be an approved premises, sticking to a curfew, which will include electronic tagging for a year, and to abide by restrictions put in place to avoid contact with the victim's family. A summary of the panel's decision said the panel concluded in a finely balanced decision that Pearson met the test for release. The panel was satisfied that imprisonment was no longer necessary for the protection of the public and that she poses no more than a minimal risk of further serious offending. So this is probably someone you may not have heard of. I only heard of her quite recently, to be honest. She's actually known as the forgotten inmate, the forgotten prisoner of the United Kingdom, because she's been effectively left behind bars, stewing, and it's took her about 10 parole attempts to be released, and she served a good almost 30 years above her tariff. It's not abnormal for lifers to serve extra time above their tariffs, regardless of how well they behave themselves and prove that they're changing. But 20, 30 years over your tariff is quite a decent amount of time extra spent in prison. But what's odd is she's done stints in open prisons and she's been returning, going back to high security estates, returning to open prison. And normally, you don't get many cracks of the whip with open prison. You usually go once or twice, and if you keep failing, they normally don't bother sending you back. So I think she's actually been released from the high security estate, which is quite odd, especially since she spent so much time behind bars and so much time in the high security estate. So she's going to have a very, very difficult readjustment when she actually does get released, because, speaking from a personal perception, I only spent 6 months in prison, and when I come out, it took me a good few weeks to get back into a routine and to get used to being outside and not having to ask for certain things, and getting used to having a door handle on my side of the door and having to go to the toilet in a different room instead of it being just next to your bed, and having to cook your own food. Little things like that which people outside and me nowadays we just take for granted, and it's just run of the mill daily living. But to someone like her, this is going to be totally new territory, and territory that she's not stepped over for nearly 40 years. But what I want to kind of discuss is, do we think that she deserved a chance, bearing in mind that she has done so many years above her minimum term? And there's always that underlying question, should life actually mean life? And she's clearly and quite quickly, between being rejected from her last parole hearing to being given a release, it's been quite a quick turnaround. So I'll be quite interested to see what she's actually done to prove that she can be released this time. But what's also interesting is Pearson actually attempted to appeal her conviction in 1988, claiming that she was not guilty because of her mental and physical state of mind. But she then changed her story and admitted killing her victim only in self-defense. But I know it's quite a stringent condition when you're up for murder, and you go for parole, that you have to at least take ownership of your offence. Because if you keep portraying that you're innocent, 9 times out of 10, or probably 10 times out of 10, they will just reject you because you portray that you're innocent. They won't accept you onto the behavioural management courses and stuff that you have to do as part of your life as plan, to then get the reports to take of you for the parole board. So it must have come to a point where she's just admitted it and just said, yeah, it was me and I'd done it because of X, Y, and Z. So obviously this appeal was dismissed, hence the amount of time she spent in prison. She then appealed to the Criminal Cases Review Commission, known as the CCRC, but this was also rejected. When this was declined, she attempted to further appeal this decision. So she's been trying for many years after her conviction, for about almost 15 years after her conviction, to try and appeal the case. And obviously it's just come to a point where she's just admitted defeat and decided just to crack on with her sentence. But what's also interesting is in 2004, so 22 years ago, this is when she was first moved to an open prison in preparation for release. Bearing in mind her tariff expired in 1998, but she was quickly returned to the high security estate after accusations of bullying and intimidation. Again, she was moved to an open prison in 2021, and the same happened again. She was accused of being a bully and intimidating and being aggressive, so she was carted off straight back to the high security estate. But also she's been reluctant to engage with professional services offered in the prison, and prisons offer all sorts. It all depends on your needs. If you've got substance issues, anger issues, mental health problems, there's services in there. A lot of it funded by the NHS, some of it funded by charitable organisations, and it's there if you want it. And she's been refusing to engage with those services, and which would be not looked on favourably when she's applying for parole, because you need to be seen to be participating in courses and programmes that will prove to be beneficial for your rehabilitation whilst you're in prison. But after taking part in a 2014 programme on improving decision making, she openly admitted at her next parole hearing that she had told the organisers what she thought they wanted to hear. So even by 2014, so how many years is that? About 25 years thereabouts, she's still not playing the game. She's still basically trying to pull the wool over people's eyes and not actually taking responsibility for the offence she's in prison for, and trying to put measures in place to ensure that it doesn't happen again if and when she is released. So a number of parole attempts were rejected, and in 2020 her 8th parole was refused, in part because she continued to be a disruptive prisoner. After her 9th rejection in 2023, the Ministry of Justice said that records showed she was the longest serving female prisoner in the UK. Similarly to previous attempts, her 2023 parole application was rejected, in part again because of poor behaviour, including being aggressive and abusive to staff. And the thing is about being a lifer, is I've noticed, is you walk a very tight line. Like any normal con who's not on a life sentence or any sort of real sentence that needs to go in front of the parole board at some point, you can have a fight, you can have, your issues with staff, you can, have your bad days, and that's okay to a certain extent. But as a lifer, you can so much as have a fight, kick off with staff, something that can be seen as trivial, but that's gone straight, that'll just be logged, and what will happen then is the parole board can actually request your antecedents, it can request any sort of depositions, prison records, security intelligence, all that sort of stuff. Even if it's not proven, even if it's just hearsay, that the prison have logged, they can request that and they can make decisions partly based on that. So lifers do have a big battle, a really big battle, to try and get parole boards to, review their cases favourably. And they'll go back years. I mean, I was speaking to one guy who, he was a lifer, but he was back in prison on recall, and they went as far as he actually got out in around 2012. They went as far back as 2001, and said, "Oh, you were caught you tested positive for heroin," and because his index offence was drug and alcohol related, they seen that as a problem. So instead of actually releasing him, they moved him to open conditions first instead of releasing him directly. And if he didn't have took those drugs all them years before, he may have actually got out, or they may have found another reason to keep him in. So it is a very, very, very hard balancing act when trying to get prison right, because if you want to toe the line and follow the rules, it may rub your fellow prisoners up the wrong way. But again, you don't want to be seen to be, a soft touch whilst in prison. So you may have to take those losses when it comes to like official hearings and things, such as parole. But yeah, so Maria's either now been released or is about to be released, because the parole board say you're released, you don't get out that day. It takes a few weeks because you need to sort out, for example, your housing, approved premises. You need to ensure that you've got certain plans in place for probation outside. And once all those are ticked off, then they'll say, right, she can come out. So I'm not too sure if she's been released yet. But if she has, then, she's got freedom to an extent. She'll be on an electric tag for quite a while, and she had to live in approved premises where it's effectively a hostel. And my mother, she actually worked in one of those hostels when she worked for the probation service, and she was telling me 90% of the residents in the hostels are actually nonces and weird people. So who's to know how she's going to react when she gets there? But it's going to be a hard readjustment for her, because, like I say, she spent basically 40 years in prison, and even after a few months in prison, it does take you a while to readjust. I mean, when I first come out, I slept on the floor for a few nights because I wasn't used to a soft mattress. I remember my first night, I woke up about 3 in the morning, because I needed the loo. And I mean, I've never had to do it in prison, but I went to my door and I was looking for the bell. But even though the toilet was in my cell when I was in prison, I just went to the toilet. I knew the toilet was outside, but I was still looking for a bell to press, like, the emergency bell. And I realised, well, I'm not in prison no more. I've got a handle that I can open and go to the toilet myself. Yeah, so just little things like that. And like I said, I've only spent a few months in prison. So it's going to be really tough for this woman. But yeah, she's going to have a very, very, very tight licence to such point where she'll have to speak to a probation officer almost daily, and they'll be tracking her like a wild animal. So yeah, it is going to be a tough one for her. But obviously she's done the work, and the parole board, they do not let people out willy-nilly, because their overriding concern is protection of the public. And if they let someone out and something terrible happens, which it can do, and every time something bad happens and you see it in the media, the parole board become that little bit more stricter and that little bit more stricter. So they've obviously felt comfortable to let her out. But if you're actually interested in how the parole board conduct themselves and how parole hearings work and what sort of information to look into before making any decisions, there's a good series on BBC iPlayer, and it's just called Parole. And I think there's about 1 or 2, there's 2 seasons, I think. And it captures prisoners' cases when they're going for the parole board, and it tells you at the end and it films them getting the report and they'll see whether they're getting released or not. So I do recommend you watch that, because it is very interesting. And also, members of the parole board, they're just volunteers. Like, they do get paid, but they're volunteered to be on the parole board. They're not, members of the police. I'd say they're not judges. You do get judicial members of the parole board. You usually see them on very, very, severe cases. You have psychiatry members. But almost anyone can be a parole board member, as long as you can pass a DBS check and, pass the interviews and things. So they're just general Joe public who sit on the parole board, really. A bit like when you go to court and you're on a trial, it's Joe public that are on the jury. Same thing on the parole board. But yeah, I recommend you watch the series, BBC iPlayer, Parole. It's very, very interesting. I thought it was anyway. I've never had to sit at parole boards. I only had to do half my sentence and get out. But it was quite enlightening to see, and me and the missus were watching it and we were thinking, she or he going to get released, I guarantee you. And you're quite shocked sometimes they don't. And people who think, they're not going to let him out, he's a prat, he's not going to let him out. And then they release them, so you don't know where it's going to go. So I would watch it. It is very, very, very interesting. But yeah, that's it on the UK's most longest serving female prisoner. Well, no longer. She's not a prisoner no more. But if you think life should mean life, then put it in the comments and explain why, because I'd love to hear it. Or do you think that she should have been given the chance to have her, last maybe decade or two out and about in the community? Do you think she was deserving of it? Or, like I say, should life actually mean life? So put your thoughts in the comments, and nice, respectable comments, please. And I'll respond to them where possible. But yeah, so that's a fairly quick one. Thank you very much for listening, and peace and love, guys.